Bom dia, bem-vindos.
Good morning and welcome to the Action4Climate high-level talk promoted by the platform, the Action4Climate of the Brazil network of the Global Pact. My name is Eliza, and I'm responsible for climate within the Pact team. I'll be your hostess today. I'd like to thank Scania, first of all, for supporting such an important event where we would talk about economic comeback and converging with the climate agenda advances in Brazil. I'd also like to thank the institutional supporters, Boticário Group, RV, and other partners, the Climate Corporate Initiative, Climate Institute, and Society, the Swedish Chamber, as well as over 1,000 members of the network. We'll be split up into two parts. The first one will be streamed live on YouTube and the UOL platform. The second part is a closed meeting, an exclusive meeting for CEOs and experts. During this pandemic scenario, it's very important to talk about the role that the corporate sector plays in the economic comeback that has to be greener, fairer, more inclusive, transparent, and integral. By promoting this dialogue among these major companies and names in sustainability, as our special guest today, Mr. Pavan Sukhdev and Mr. Johan Rockström, we hope to have our Brazilian corporate leadership engaged in an ambitious manner with the climate agenda. So I'd like to ask Mr. Nicky Fabiancic, the resident coordinator of the UN in Brazil, for his opening remarks. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Eliza. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off by welcoming Mr. Johan Rockström, the director of the Institute of Investigations on the Climate Impact, and Mr. Pavan Sukhdev, the CEO of Just Advisory Switzerland, and Mr. Henrik Henriksson, the president and CEO of the Scania Group, and Mr. Roland Sorrell, Director of Sustainability of CPFL Energy and President of the Global Pact Brazilian Network, and the members of the board of the Brazil Network and Executive Director Carlos Pereira. To all the other CEOs, directors, and sustainability leaders, our supporters and sponsors, to my colleagues of the United Nations system in Brazil, and everyone that is attending on the live stream of this event. First of all, I would like to thank the Global Pact Network for this opportunity to say a few words in such an important and critical moment to Brazil and the world, whose actions have a huge impact today and in the future. As a representative of the 26 areas of the programs that integrate the UN program in Brazil, I appreciate the commitment and leadership of the companies that are here today with the 2030 agenda and the outreach of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. The year of 2020 was announced as a crucial year for the planet in facing global warming by holding high-level conferences. However, we were surprised by a global health problem, a pandemic that impacts everyone, societies, economies, and consequently the environment. The pandemic has significantly increased challenges and exacerbated inequalities of all kinds. It has multiplied the difficulties and seriously threatened the progress that we have had. In view of the challenges ahead of us. We cannot be indifferent to all of this. The pandemic, even though tragic, can be seen by a unique opportunity to face the challenges with innovative solutions that are more sustainable, less informal, and more inclusive. Within that context, the private sector has a critical role to play in this transition and transformation of the business models in a more comprehensive manner in committing to the UN agenda and implement the Paris Agreement. It's a matter of a more aware comeback and building forward better with systemic changes, and particularly our global consumption and production standards, as well as solid policies that will create the necessary framework and the conditions to move forward. One of the most prominent industries where these systemic changes should take place include production and consumption of energy, food systems, infrastructure, residue and waste management. However, more comprehensive changes should be expected in the transforming changes in funding and markets and legal systems, as well as digital and technological ecosystems to create enabling environments that are widely necessary. Therefore, the private sector should actively engage to support the necessary transition to a low carbon economy. For that to happen, we need more openness in terms of discussing policies and reports with many stakeholders, through which the private sector can share ideas and best practices about specific topics, as well as partnerships, alliances, and transactions to achieve specific objectives if we want to effectively expand. It's important to say that the Brazilian private sector has shown strong alignment and engagement with the sustainability agenda. Actions such as the corporate group charter and the representatives of corporate groups, among many of them present here, Mr. Hamilton Mourão, asking the government to adopt concrete actions to overcome the environmental crisis, or initiatives such as WE3 that are updating their sustainable development goals for carbon and seeking to act in mechanisms with green bonds, are the clear signs of being in tune with the climate agenda and environmental actions. So we wish to have this commitment with the Brazilian companies and the Brazilian regulators. We have the example of the Brazilian Central Bank that has equally recognized the climate issue as a risk to the system and monetary policies, as well as there's an incentive for green financing and credit based on sustainable assumptions. One of the main measures with more immediate effect would be the obligation of financial institutions to adopt the report within the molds of climate-related disclosures task force. So looking forward, using digitization to overcome the increased issues or inequalities shown by the pandemic. As we can see, the issues that we have in terms of illegality that affects the development will also be crucial so that we can have an equal playing field as we get out of the crisis. For those who are part of the COVID meetings, had an opportunity to hear Professor Arvix yesterday sharing data about how the inequality in digital inclusion has highly affected education for poorest people, leaving over 30% of Brazilian children outside the education system. It's very relevant to discuss the changes that are necessary in terms of policies and incentives to have universal access and digital inclusion for everyone. In today's event, over 30 business leaders and renowned specialists will be here together to debate solutions and identify work opportunities in a coordinated manner, aiming at having a better and stronger comeback. As the directors of these institutions are focusing on the positive climate actions launched in April by the UN to deliver a low carbon resilient world. So first of all, as we invest to recover from the coronavirus, we should create jobs and business through a clean and green transition. For business, that could be done through public commitments and goals based on science, and these commitments leverage innovation. Second, not facilitate for polluters. That means that when the money of taxpayers is used to rescue companies, it must be connected to obtaining green jobs and sustainable growth. Establish internal or domestic price for carbon to direct investments for the future is a good way to internalize that point. Third, end subsidies for fossil fuels. Companies must help to conduct a change from a gray economy to a green economy by investing in low carbon and disruptive innovations. For the risks and opportunities of the climate should be included in decision making in the financial system, as well as in all the aspects of the formulation of public policies and infrastructure. 5, we must work together. Companies must engage responsibly in public policies as well as act in advocacy movements to support this transition. 6, not leave anyone behind. Work with local communities, focusing on resilience and identifying co-benefits of operations in climate and health. At the UN, we have initiatives that could be of interest of the companies, and I'd like to highlight one special one of the research development of globally, which is part of the UNDP. This project has over 50 organizations from 50 different countries, and together as partners of the industry, research agencies, civil society, trade, among others, will study all the steps of the supply chain. Last year, we already held the first meetings in Brazil to define the path of the impact that that project may have. As the General Adjunct Secretary, Ms. Muhammad, who addressed yesterday during the high-level meeting yesterday, quote, there is no vaccine that can quickly and simply resolve the social and economic crisis that we currently face, unquote. So we must think innovatively and differently to strengthen communities and come back as one single front, ready to face any crisis and problems that might come forth, unquote. So I hope I can count on everyone here today so that together we can work to translate ideas into opportunities, into concrete actions. With your support, together we can achieve the solutions that Brazil requires to overcome the COVID-19 crisis and create a more sustainable and inclusive country. The platform Action4Climate that is promoting this dialogue here today is trying to develop an area to develop partnerships and solutions towards that aim. I'd like to reiterate the invitation to everyone to access the UN Global Compact Network. And now I'd like to wish all of you a great event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nick. Thank you for honoring you with us with your presence. Your talk was very necessary and inspiring. It's an honor that I would like to announce our first speaker, Professor Sukhdev. I'm sorry, Dr. Rockström. He's a very well-known name in climate. He's known all over the world for his studies on stability. He spearheaded a group of international scientists to establish the 9 limits of the planet that are considered today essential to continue operating safely for mankind. He will talk to us about some of the trends of the climate agenda all around the world. You have the floor, Dr. Rockström.
Thanks very much, Elisa, and great to be here at this very important juncture, following on the very important intervention by Nikki Fabiancic, pointing out that the climate transition must now be focusing on a resilient recovery in the post-COVID world, and that this is also an alignment for business in the world. Let me now give you the scientific rationale to show how right he is in his assessment. Now, the entry point for this fundamentally is the scientific conclusion that we have now entered a new level of turbulence in the world. We are now in the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch where we, anthros, as humans, are the dominating force of change on Earth. This means that the scale and the speed and the interconnectivity between environmental change, climate change, disease patterns, financial change, social instabilities are interacting faster and faster, more and more often, with higher and higher impacts. So much so that we can today say that without any hesitation, that the climate crisis we're facing is tightly interconnected with the corona crisis we are in the midst of, and the ecosystem crisis that we're also in the midst of. And that these are so tightly connected that we must understand that the only way to reduce risks of health pandemics, risks of security, risks of undermining possibilities of jobs, economies, and stable societies is by investing in sustainability, just like Mr. Fabiancic pointed out. In fact, we have evidence, as I'm sure you know, that the frequency of zoonotic viral disease outbreaks, when viruses spill over from wildlife through domestic animals to humans, just like the coronavirus, but take Ebola, take SARS, are all on the increase. They're increasing very rapidly and have done so over the past 20 years. Why is this? Well, it is a result of the human interventions in the biosphere. It is an expansion of human agriculture through deforestation, ecosystem destruction. And when this occurs in an increasingly globalized, dense world, you have a much larger risk of these kind of viral spillovers propelling themselves in a hyper-connected world of global trade and travel. So this is a manifestation. The COVID-19 is a manifestation of the Anthropocene. Now, let me look into the risk pattern we're facing. This is just from a few days ago, the latest study on sea level rise. You may have read about it, that we're following the worst case scenario of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC's projection. Their projection is that we face 60 to 100 centimeters of sea level rise until the end of this century. Now, the latest satellite-based data on Greenland and Antarctica shows that it's melting faster than the IPCC had predicted, that we're now facing an additional 20 centimeters of sea level rise, affecting 16 million people across the world, and putting us at risk of beyond 1 meter sea level rise this century. Last week, I had a session together with the German government of the representatives from the low-lying island states in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, who are, as you know, negotiating evacuation plans already at the lower sea level rise scenarios. This is perhaps, I would argue, but I'm an Earth system scientist, I must excuse myself, but I think this is the most humbling graph we have in science today. It is coming from the latest climate modeling. It is colleagues at the Potsdam Institute who for the first time have been able to run a climate model for the past 3 million years. So the x-axis here is 3 million years. This is the so-called Pleistocene geological epoch. It is basically the period when the planet has looked roughly the same way as the planet we know today. On the y-axis here, you have deviation from the pre-industrial average temperature on Earth. So 0 is roughly 14 degrees Celsius, the average temperature before we started burning fossil fuels. What you see here is that despite all the solar orbital forcing, all the volcanic eruptions, all the earthquakes, going in and out of ice ages and interglacials, all these natural variabilities, the planet, as far as we know, has never exceeded 2 degrees Celsius. So we've been oscillating within a very narrow band for 3 million years. Plus 2 degrees Celsius, the warmest level on Earth, minus 4 to 6 degrees Celsius, deep ice age. In and out. We've been bumped through natural variability. Why is this? Well, it's because the natural biosphere, the living parts of nature, are so resilient that they have been helping to dampen physical forcing from space. And that this is what has been keeping the planet within this narrow range. This, in my mind, is the perhaps strongest message to all our policymakers and businesses that we must stay below 2 degrees, because go beyond 2, we entered on uncharted territory. In fact, it's so uncharted, it is like winding back the climate clock 4 million years. So this is something to bear in mind when it comes to the future of deviating away from the risks we're facing. These are the observations, you know them. We are today at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming. I try to remind, when I take that number, that this is the warmest temperature on Earth since the last ice age, which we left 12,000 years ago. Here are, you know these numbers, the last 20 years, the 19 warmest years of record is over the past 20 years. The warmest one outside of that period is 1998. You all remember it, the devastating El Niño amplified year of 1998, with devastating floods in Africa, devastating droughts in parts of Latin America and in Asia. Now, 2020 is on its way to be the second warmest on record. I just showed this graph just to show you that the temperature records today come from so many sources. These are independent global observation systems from NASA to Berkeley, to the Chinese system, to the UK system. We are sitting on a massive Earth observation knowledge base today. Translated by NOAA into the extreme events of 2020, this is a photographic image of June 2020. The record temperatures in Latin America and Brazil, the forest fires already emerging in California, the massive continued drought situation in East Africa that has been colliding, as you know, with the desert locust invasion, causing food riots in the midst of the COVID crisis. You don't want to have food riots when you have social distancing requirements in a pandemic. You have the heat waves in Europe. You have the Arctic sea ice, now again on a record low in 2020. West Antarctica, the Thwaites glaciers sliding into the ocean because of record warmth. We have the 38 degrees Celsius record in Siberia, which also is connected with forest fires and permafrost thawing earlier this year. In the midst of the pandemic, we have an extreme year on climate. Despite all this occurring at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, it's good to remind ourselves that 95% of the heat caused by our fossil fuel burning is taken up in the oceans. It's the oceans that buffer, the oceans that take the big resilience step at this time step. But of course, this is also what makes El Nino events more amplified. It's also what makes and determines the monsoon systems in both South Asia, West Africa, and over Brazil. So we mapped last year, for the first time, the big systems that regulates the state of the planet. These are the so-called tipping elements. We know 15 of these systems. These are the big systems that we know we depend upon to keep the planet in this nice +2, -6 oscillation. So here you have the Amazon rainforest, which is a biome that contributes to regulate the whole planetary stability. The West Antarctic ice shelf, Greenland, coral reef systems, the permafrost. But look at the Atlantic circulation there, the middle blob there in the North Atlantic, connected both to the Arctic and to Antarctica. It has slowed down by 15%. This makes me very nervous as a Nordic, because it's the Gulf Stream that makes it possible to live in Scandinavia. This is connected also to the rainfall patterns over the Amazon rainforest. So we have come today to a point where science is showing that these tipping points in the Earth system are interconnected via the ocean heat, and that can impact on rainfall patterns, which can hit droughts and forest fires in the rainforests. So this is the new risk landscape we're facing. I know that Carlos Nobres, you are on this meeting, the scientific lead on the understanding that deforestation combined with temperature can make a special vulnerability point where the Amazon could cross a tipping point and irreversibly move towards a savanna state. The latest paper on this that you published, Carlos, together with Tom Lovejoy, I think is a fundamental frontier in science, and we need to understand increasingly how these different impacts are interconnected, deforestation and climate change. IPCC has started to truly assess this pattern of increased knowledge. This is a document published just before the COVID-19 crisis broke out, United in Science, by the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, and IPCC and Future Earth, showing the last 19 years of scientific advancement. What you see here is the so-called famous red embers diagram. The darker the red, the higher the risk. On the y-axis here is deviation, again, in global mean temperature from pre-industrial levels. So the higher up you are, the higher is the temperature, up to 6 degrees Celsius. And what you see here in each column is one IPCC assessment. So further to the left is the state of science 19 years ago in 2001. And then further to the right, you have the state of knowledge today after the 1.5 degrees Celsius report in 2018. Just back off here, you see that the more we learn of risks in climate impacts, the lower is the temperature, meaning that already at 2 degrees Celsius today, we are at risk of triggering large-scale changes, which is the cluster further to the right, and further to the left is the cluster of risks of changing big ecosystems. 19 years ago, we thought that the risks were very low. We thought that it was potentially at 5-6 degrees Celsius warming. So as you see, the more we learn, the more science is advancing, the higher is the reason for concern. And this is the state of knowledge as we are today. That is why over 100 countries and cities around the world have declared a state of climate emergency. We have been considering now the need to proclaim a state of planetary emergency. The World Economic Forum comes out every year, as you know, with the Global Risk Report, also showing how business leaders in the world are really starting to understand how the likelihood and impact of large risks are related. And here you see the summary in the green ROMs of the highest risk sources of risk. And if you can read those small letters there, it says climate failure, biodiversity loss, natural disasters, extreme weather events. This is the new risk landscape that is also understood by business. So we need to understand this and move in a direction away from these risks. I just want to emphasize that these are not environmental risks. These are risks for human well-being and for security. Here is one example of how we increasingly have indications of how climate impacts and ecosystem degradation impacts on security across the world, with risk of migration, displacement, and conflict. We also have the economic case, which of course is of huge interest for business leaders. This is just one example of science that have been published just the last few weeks, showing that the social cost of carbon is much, much higher than previously thought. Something like $100 per ton of carbon dioxide, which means that the cost for social and economic development of continuing burning fossil fuels is much, much higher than we previously thought, which would argue very strongly that there's an even economic case to stay below 2 degrees Celsius and reach the Paris Agreement. So we have just in a closing few minutes translated all this risk into a pathway to solution. We call this the carbon law, inspired by the Moore's law, inspired by the pace of innovation that we now need to embark on to scale to be able to keep the global temperature well below 2. The carbon law translates into the pace of reduction of emissions we need to follow to succeed with staying well below 2. And it looks like this. What you see here is the IPCC assessments of the scenarios that can take us with a reasonably high percentage of probability to below 2 degrees Celsius. The gray line is the carbon law, that we need to bend the global curve of emissions this year, actually, 2020, this super year, and then reduce the emissions by cutting them by half every decade. So if we can cut emissions by half every decade, we follow the carbon law that takes us to a net zero carbon world economy in 30 years' time. That's our task. But I just want to emphasize with a group like this one, that that's not enough. We also need to maintain the resilience in the natural ecosystems, which is shown in green and blue here. All the climate models that takes us safely to Paris depend on a continued ability in nature to absorb carbon and keep carbon stocks intact. And that requires managing biodiversity. So that is the pathway. Can we do it? Well, together with Christiana Figueres, who worked very actively with Pavan Sukhdev and others to take us safely to the Paris Climate Agreement, showing that, yes, if you map the known technologies and known practices and sector by sector, we can follow the exponential carbon law of cutting emissions every decade. Here's a mapping of the first decade from 2020 to 2030 in sector by sector by sector. What you see here, I just want to the key message here is that mapping existing technologies with existing businesses, wedge by wedge and sector by sector, there are solutions that can take us to cutting emissions by half over the first decade. This is really reassuring that there's not utopia, it's not science fiction, it is really economically competitive. It has many win-win effects on health in particular. You go electric on mobility, you have clean air, you have better lung capacity, better ability to deal with pandemics, for example. So that's exciting. We've translated that to what we call the 1.5 degrees Celsius business playbook, sector by sector, to be able to communicate science to business in this transition. And we're seeing increasingly that we're putting the landscape of a new governance model to be able to really transition into a prosperous, equitable future within a stable planet that does not deviate away from that 3 million year Pleistocene oscillation pattern we've had between +2 and -4. And that we need to bring in global systemic risks like the pandemic and global climate risks and biodiversity risks into the business model. And business is very well placed to address risk. So I think that is one of the great opportunities to address risk, map risk, cost risk, and define science-based targets to stay within a safe operating space. And my final figure that I often like to communicate, and I know that Pavan and I have actually been communicating this together in different occasions, is that we now need to merge the Sustainable Development Goals, here illustrated in the circle of all the 17 goals, within a stable planet. We're truly in this people-planet phase of development. We now need to become stewards of the whole system. And irrespective of whether you sit in Sao Paulo or in Stockholm or in New Delhi, to become planetary stewards. Just in the words of Nikki Fabiancic, together. I think that was a very important message you gave earlier here. So with that, thank you very much and good luck with the continued deliberations. Thank you.
Muitíssimo obrigada, professor. Muitíssimo obrigada.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your comments. They're always very valuable, and you always give us this such important sense of urgency for the climate agenda. Now I have the pleasure of invite our second special guest, Mr. Pavan Sukhdev. He's the CEO of Just Advisory, President of WWF International, Ambassador of Goodwill from UN the Environment. He's a leader in the mindset of sustainability and innovator in sustainability metrics, and also very influent. He's going to talk about how companies fit into this new moment where we have the economic comeback, considering the climate agenda. The floor is yours.
Sorry, I was saying thank you, Eliza, and thank you, Nikki and Johan, for laying the ground for me so well to talk about business responsibilities and opportunities. And as Johan has pointed out, we are talking about emergency. So even though my voice may not carry panic, please understand that I am a seriously worried person. So I speak with urgency and a request to everyone that, we are in this together. I remain optimistic. As Winston Churchill said, there's no point being a pessimist, but at the same time, the time for action is now. We are going through a time of crises. There are many: climate, health, jobs, GDP. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, here's a quick summary. People sometimes forget that the markets can be misleading indicators. And if you look at the financial markets, equities, S&P and so on, and NASDAQ even, you might think over the last 6 months, we're doing fine. We are up 6, 8, 20%. But that's, unfortunately, markets represents the asset of the rich, and the economy represents mainly the jobs of the poor. And I'm afraid the news on that front is very bad. We've had, for a long time, since the last recession, 2008-9, we've had chronic unemployment of about 200 million unemployed, but that shot up by another 480 million over the last 6 months as a result of COVID. And that's actually a key worry, especially countries in Africa, where the unemployment seems to be concentrating in the youth, which of course is a powder keg for social unrest. So what is in fact a health emergency driven by our lack of harmony with nature has spilled across into a social emergency and could even be potentially a powder keg politically. We have to watch out for this. Globally, the job losses numbers are quite bad, as you can see. These are quarterly numbers on the left-hand side, where I'm comparing the loss of jobs vis-a-vis the last quarter of 2019. Of course, GDP is about output and production. So in some ways, I'm actually less worried about the losses in output that we are seeing across large economies such as the European Union and the US. What saddens me, of course, is the climate-related disasters, the deaths of almost 1 million people around the world, and the dislocations and unemployment that result as from all of this. We need to fight this. And at the same time, I will point out that the Chinese word for crisis, which is clearly what we are facing, is Weiji. It's a composite. It's a combination of danger and opportunity. And it's ironic that, Johan, you mentioned the targets, which I fully endorse and would want us to abide by the carbon law. This year, if we were to go by the targets of the United Nations, we should be reducing, according to them, for a 1.5 degree target, emissions by 7.2%. Well, the projected cost of that, according to the emissions gap report, was between 1.6 and $3.8 trillion. But look what we've done. Thanks to the COVID crisis, which is unfortunately the worst possible way of trying to achieve a UN target, we have actually achieved it. We are down 7% already. But of course, the result of that is 1 million lost lives and a cost to the economy of more than 8.5 trillion over the next 2 years. So the costs are much, much bigger than what we have projected. Business as usual, which is the disaster approach, is clearly much more expensive. than doing things in a planned and organized way. The time of crisis, however, comes laden with what I call redesign opportunities, and there are many. We have at the backdrop the global goals 2030. We have the EU Green Deal, which will lead to a combination of SDGs being seen nowadays as policy reform points. So essentially, they are means for policymakers, for businesses, and indeed for NGOs to congregate, to pull their strengths together and to come forward and make suggestions of changes. The second trend that I'm seeing very powerfully, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, is what I call a tsunami of investor interest in so-called SRI, socially responsible investment, and ESG assets. And there is a change in discourse taking place between boutique and maybe isolated and small so-called impact investors to something which I call investor impacts. Understanding that all portfolios potentially need to be green and have to be green in order for us to change the direction of the economy towards an inclusive green economy of permanence, and one which abides by the kind of carbon law that Johan spoke about. Again, the news is relatively positive. We are seeing the insertion of purpose. The idea of corporations having to pursue purpose rather than just profits was a central theme at Davos this year in January. Before that, the US Business Roundtable came out declaring this, and that's an unusual thing to happen, in considering that the United States is the cradle and the home of Milton Friedman, which is basically the philosophy that has driven us in this direction. So we are seeing a democratization of the concept of sustainability at a level which actually has never been seen before. Let me share with you some of the statistics which illustrate the point I made about the investors. Here's some surprising statistics on the growth of sustainable investing. If we look at the total volume of debt and equity instruments that have been subjected through one of the many lenses of sustainability, that quantity has increased from 13 trillion in 2012, this is a survey that's done once every 2 years, to 30 trillion in 2018, and that's the latest survey. That's a significant increase, and at that point, it represents almost 10% of the total assets, invested assets around the world. And there's more. We have what I call a whole slew of institutional response frameworks coming up. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has made some progress. Banks are following it and insisting on their borrowers to provide the reporting that they need to comply with it in terms of the risks and the institutional responses. That has led in turn to some conversations on a comparable task force, not just on climate impacts, but on nature impacts, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And Johan and WWF and others have been involved in steering us towards a philosophy where we would like to see what is being referred to a new deal for nature and people, which reduces the impacts to zero, basically no net loss of biodiversity in overall, and indeed a bending of the curve, in other words, a reversal of fortunes for nature, while nature should be allowed to regrow back rather than to constantly be depleted. So all of these are positive initiatives, and I think my only worry is that they need to be integrated. The whole idea of collaboration needs to be very forcefully brought to the fore, and that integration of these integrators actually will deliver us the changes that we need. This includes, of course, measuring performance differently. So once again, we have success. 2018 saw the latest of 3 United Nations reports using inclusive wealth as the yardstick and not just GDP. Inclusive wealth as in the total assets available to a nation divided by the population of that nation. And this is now becoming much more mainstream. And on the flip side, compared to the macro level, we are seeing a whole number of initiatives, including integrated reporting, the work of the Capitals Coalition, the work of the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, the new initiatives of the so-called Value Balancing Alliance, which has done fantastic work pulling together the 4 accountancy majors, the big 4 as we call them, as well as the European Union and a number of leading corporations, to move towards what we call either integrated profit and loss, or what is sometimes referred to as impact-weighted accounts. Now, impact-weighted accounts and integrated profit and loss are the same thing, and I'm delighted that these ideas have now become so much in the forefront. George Serafim, my friend, teaches at Harvard. He talks about impact-weighted accounts. The Value Balancing Alliance talks about integrated profit and loss. My own company does work in this. So this is now happening. There are at least 100 companies who already moved forward in this direction. So these are the positives that I want to point out to you, and which is why I remain an optimist, that if we persist, we can actually bend the curve. We can actually redesign the economy. Brazil has absolutely a central role to play in that redesign. To begin with, let me remind you what I've been saying at least for the last 12 years since I've been visiting you in Brazil, which is that you are the global capital for natural capital. Amazonia has the largest area of the world's rainforest. Yes, it is at risk, as has been pointed out, because of climate factors. The rainfall cycle itself is at risk due to climatic changes. But for the time being, it is still the largest supplier of and the largest rainfall factory on the planet. It discharges the largest amount of fresh water, as it happened, which reaches the world oceans. We can move these ideas towards a point where they get acknowledged and they get recognized in global agreements and global mechanisms to reward the maintenance of these systems. I'm not saying that we can reverse this trend, or we can certainly slow it down. That's the point I'm making. But then the leadership on that change has to come from here, from Brazil. You need to recognize, acknowledge, and take the leadership in your hands. And when I say you, I'm referring to all of you. The citizens, for whom I have great admiration amongst all of you. The businesses who have done numerous initiatives over the last few years, including sustainable soya, including coming out with ideas on protecting the rainforest, and the banks, Bradesco and Itaú and others have been consciously differentiating and looking to differentiate in lending for sustainable versus unsustainable businesses. So there's clearly areas where there needs to be focus here, and all of these are business areas. So I would point out 4 where, in my opinion, focus is required: an energy transition, a food system transition, a transition in the way that corporations define and report performance, and a transition in how financing is done towards sustainable assets and away from stranded assets and unsustainable assets. Let me talk about energy for a few moments. Look at this chart. It shows you the way in which prices of grid scale power have moved over the last 8-10 years. If we look from 2010 to 2018, you'll actually notice that the price of hydro has gone up slightly from 3.7 cents to 4.7 cents. The price of solar photovoltaic has dropped dramatically. And by the way, those are weighted average numbers for 2018. The latest prices for solar photovoltaic show that the drop has been from over 35 cents per kilowatt hour in 2010 down to less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And some of these prices also include storage. So they are comprehensive of the kind of the pumped hydro storage, for example, that goes very well with large hydro projects which have floating solar or nearby solar photovoltaic. So these are now solutions which are sitting with us. These solar photovoltaic is already much cheaper than coal-fired power stations. So a transition in the way the economy provides power to the grid will clearly continue to happen. This is why we are seeing the performance of solar companies, despite being seen as commoditized providers, as being relatively good. And the market's beginning to recognize that in its responses as well. We are seeing progress on likewise on wind, but of course, wind's been there for quite some time. But to me, solar solutions are much more real today than they have been before. And the unexplored hydro and geothermal solutions are sitting there, waiting to be enlarged. And pumped hydro has less than 1/10 of its current capacity around the world being utilized. So there's a long way to go for storing electricity using nothing but gravity. Here's the investments that you can see, a dramatic way of change, which you can see over the last decade, more than a decade in this case. And the yellow bars represent solar PV, and the blue bars represent hydropower and wind. And you can see the overall change and growth in renewable energy investments over time. Yes, the total amounts are still under 200 billion per annum. And yes, that is still under the overall investment that is required to transition towards an inclusive green economy of permanence is variously estimated as between $1 and $2.5 trillion per annum. And 1.2 is the one that came from the United Nations. But the point is, the amount investable in renewable energy was actually around what we see now, which is 250 billion per year. So we are there to create the transition that we need. On the food side, unfortunately, the news is not so good. The food systems are definitely broken, and I need to look nowhere beyond just the state of the purpose of the food systems. Out of the 7 billion people today, almost 800 million are still starving. More than 700 million are obese, and the starving are amongst those who are also micronutrient deficient, for which the number is 2 billion, which unfortunately has even some overlap with those who are overweight, which is 1.9 billion. The health costs of our current food system are humongous. The 2016 Global Nutrition Report literally pointed out this in its headline, saying that our diets have become the #1 burden of disease when it comes to human health. That's staggering, considering how many other diseases there are. Diseases such as obesity and diabetes especially have grown phenomenally over the last few decades. We've seen an increase from 100 million people affected by diabetes to more than 425 million. And that increase has been accompanied today with a bill, which is almost $850 billion per annum, just treatment of diabetes alone. So that's not good news. And thanks to the overuse of pesticides and fertilizers, both on-farm and off-farm health has been affected. And thanks to the use of antibiotics, antibiotic resistance has been building up. So there's a lot that's going wrong in human health, human capital, as a result of the broken food system. The other side of this, which is not enough recognized, is that there are huge opportunities. And again, I bring my point right down to Brazil, where excellent work has been done. And I mentioned this earlier, the leadership on the soya side, the soya moratorium, and the collaboration that we have seen in companies here in Brazil to try and change the needle, to change the direction in which things are moving, reducing the deforestation and at the same time, nevertheless managing to increase the area under crop cover. So we have examples right here in Brazil of sustainable farming at scale. And in my country, in India, we have an amazing example with more than 600,000 farmers having transitioned completely, committed to transition away from chemical farming to natural farming, and more than 50,000 already having transitioned across, with increases in yield, decreases in water usage, improvements in human health, both on-farm and off-farm, and at the same time, naturally, a reduction in climate costs, in fact, the other way around, the climate gain. Other opportunities will need a bit of political maneuvering right now, and all of you are aware of the stress and tension that goes on today with Brazil and Mercosur. But I believe this is something that you should not give up on. The opportunity is too great. Your region is huge. Mercosur's so-called draft free trade agreement with the European Union is worth $19 trillion of goods and services, and that's not something that you should take lightly. My advice is for the people of Brazil, the businesses of Brazil, and the politicians of Brazil, please, let's recognize we are on the same side. There's no point in being opposed on these issues. Yes, there may be differences of opinion, but this needs resolution in the interest of both parties, Brazil as well as the European Union. Both parties have significant commitments in trade and services in both directions. I come now to the whole issue of the SDGs, and Johan and I worked on the diagram on the left-hand side. I still use it, Johan. I think it's a powerful way of explaining the interconnectivity of the SDGs, and a powerful way of explaining to people that the SDGs are not a menu like a restaurant menu. You can just pick and choose one and run with it, but they are a set. They work together. And not only a set, but they have a structure. You need to focus on the foundational SDGs, which are the ecological SDGs, which is SDG 6 for water, 13 for climate, 14 and 15 for land and life underwater. Only when you achieve that will you ensure the GDP of the poor, as Teeb used to call it, is protected. And only when you achieve that will you ensure that the societal goals of reduced poverty and increased agri-productivity sustainably and improved balance and better gender equity and good health, so SDG number 3, the so-called social goals, only then will you achieve the social goals. And only when you have achieved the social goals will you be able to achieve the economic goals, the efficiency goals, the productivity goals. So these are all connected, and there's a natural progression from one to the other. And I'm just laying out for you on the right-hand side, and I encourage every member of the business community who's on this call, please, if you need this help, just send me an email. But this is something you should be doing. You should all be aware of the significant impact that you make on the SDGs. Whether we do or don't succeed by 2030 is in your hands. 2/3 of the economy is private sector. 2/3 of the impacts on the environment, the planetary boundaries that Johan has mentioned earlier, those come from the private sector. So we need to recognize that. And of course, that band of livability within the social floor and the ecological ceiling that you saw in an earlier slide from Johan, that band is in your hands. You need to make this happen. And that collaboration that you work within your sectors, be it in mining or fashion or tourism or in finance, needs to recognize the three layers: the biospheric layer, the social layer, and the economic layer of these SDGs. And as you can see, no matter which, I'm quite happy to draw this out for you, no matter what industry you're in, I can assure you that there will be implications for each of your industries in each of these layers. So truly, they are a set, not a menu. You need to work across the entire column of SDGs that you look before you. My company is GIST, and by the way, we actually do these calculations. We calculate so-called impact-weighted accounts and integrated profit and loss. And then just to emphasize the point to our corporate clients, we convert those amounts by looking down the 175 SDG targets which are involved, and we convert them also into SDG impacts. Only for this reason, because we want people to recognize and take ownership of their SDG impacts at the same time as they pursue their profits for their shareholders, or their human capital creation for their employees, or their social capital creation for the societies in which they live and work, or indeed the GDP impacts, the financial value addition for the countries to which they belong. Do that, all that's of course necessary. That is about stakeholder performance. But at the same time, recognize that stakeholder performance has huge implications for SDG impacts. And yes, you can and you should calculate these impacts. This is an example. So this is all possible, right? I'm not describing any theory anymore. This is actual stuff that we have done for companies and indeed for portfolio investors who've asked us to do this for them. And the example in front of you is in fact based on published information by the company. So this can actually be crawled from the web, and the data can be integrated with models, scientific models and economic valuation models to give you the impacts. So we can actually do this as a third party. Imagine how much better you could do it yourselves with any help from any investors or from these models. All of this is possible. Working out your impacts in capital terms, your contribution to society, and how much that means in SDGs. And the message to investors and to banks is, please do this for your loan portfolios and for your asset portfolios. Whether you're an asset manager with trillions of dollars, or whether you are a private equity fund with only hundreds of millions of dollars, it doesn't matter. It's equally important for you to look at the overall performance, because, mark my words, if you are missing an externality which is significant, either positive or negative, and especially if it's negative, you're missing positive alpha, right? That's the hidden positive alpha that you didn't know about and nobody told you about. And if it's negative, it's the hidden negative alpha. That negative alpha could be the difference between failure and success. It could be the difference between you exiting that portfolio in 10 years' time as a private equity fund, or as an asset manager, pleasing or displeasing your asset owners. It makes a huge difference. Today's externalities are tomorrow's risks, and tomorrow's risks are day after tomorrow's costs, right? Please don't wait for them to come home to roost and bite you in the back when you can address them today. There are 4 things you can do starting now to summarize. Number 1, let's all concentrate on energy. Energy sustainability, transition to renewables is definitely on, right? It's a business. Many of you are in it already, but I think policymakers and businesses themselves should work towards what they can do further in this case. On food sustainability, there are opportunities in natural farming. Consumer behavior is changing. The willingness to consume chemically grown food as against naturally grown food is changing very dramatically around the world. And you in Brazil are one of the biggest providers of food into the global food system. You have an opportunity, therefore. In terms of corporate sustainability, there are many corporate leaders on the call out here. Please embrace measuring of stakeholder performance. It's all work that happens. It's nothing theoretical anymore. And finally, in terms of sustainable financing, my message to bankers and lending bankers, as well as investment bankers, and also to the asset managers and portfolios, no more excuses. Please don't rely on just qualitative and judgmental ways of doing ESG rating methodologies, right? And there are more than 600 different ESG rating methodologies. My observation is that many of them are being used as what I call eyewash. Eyewash as in investor wash. Please don't do that. This is the equivalent of greenwash for the corporations, and the corporations have learned to avoid that. Now time has come for the investors to step back for a moment and say, given that we can measure impacts and evaluate impacts and measure them in economic terms, why are we still looking at qualitative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ratings? Why can't we just measure and value impacts? This information is power. This knowledge is power in your hands. Please use the power well. You will succeed, and it will give us a green and equitable economy of permanence, one which can abide by carbon laws, provide a future for us, save us from further conflict with the environment, natural environment, further pandemics, and so on, and hopefully bend the curve of nature loss, like my colleagues at the WWF like to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pavan. Muito obrigada, Sr. Pavan, pela sua fala.
Thank you, Mr. Sukhdev, for your kind words, for bringing such great opportunities for the Brazilian private corporate sector. And to conclude this part of the event, I would like to invite Mr. Henriksson, a global CEO of Scania Group, that was a sponsor for this event. Thank you, Scania, once again. And please, Mr. Henriksson, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, distinguished speakers, and also all ladies and gentlemen online. So Johan Rockström was asking and saying that we need to stay below 2. And Pavan was also mentioning that the business need to go in and show actions. So I will give you an example of what we are doing in our industry. We are making trucks and buses, but we belong to an ecosystem of transport and logistics. And that ecosystem represents somewhere between 15 and 20% of the global CO2 emissions. So we are definitely part of a problem, but we want to be part of a solution. And what we have done as a company is to take a firm position with a strong purpose to drive the shift towards a more sustainable transport system. And we are confirming this commitment by signing up for science-based targets that has been approved since a while back, where we are then taking into action then the carbon law that Johan was talking about, that in every decade we tried then to reduce our CO2 footprint with 50%. From 2015 to 2025, we will then reduce our CO2 with 50%. And we will not only commit ourselves when it comes to our own industrial operation, which we have already today, including our operation in Brazil, which is quite significant, turn it into renewable energy, 100% already. But that I would say that that's the small part. For a company like Scania, when it comes to our global footprint of our operation, only 5% of what we do is when we actually source and build our trucks and buses. 95% of our footprint comes from when our vehicles are out on the road during 10, 15, 20 years. So of course, that is the area that we need to address. So including in our science-based target, also our scope 3 is a firm commitment that we take on the responsibility that to reduce the emissions also from our customers. And how are we going to do that? Yes, there is a lot of talks about electrification, and I think, yes, it's going to come. But of course, electrification also has to come with a well-to-wheel perspective. We need to look at where do the minerals come from to produce the batteries? Where does the energy come from that we charge the batteries with? And of course, that has to be renewable. But we are coming into a sweet spot now where technology is maturing and the cost of technology is reaching parity so that it will be competitive for our customers, which are all business to business, to invest in this new technology. But it will not come at the same time all over the world. This will be a transition for the coming 15 years. And as Johan said, already 2020 is, of course, an important year. We need to break the curve, and we need to make sure that we see sort of improvements. And then we cannot sit and wait for some silver bullet technology that is coming tomorrow, even if it will work. That is the electrification. Now, what can we do here and now? And that is when we can work with biofuels. Biodiesel, bioethanol, and biogas. Fuels that are coming from residuals, from industry, from agriculture, or from the households. And here, I would say that when I travel around the world in many countries, my favorite sort of place to come to where there are the strong advocates and the pioneers for biofuels is in Brazil. There are so many good examples of how Brazil has been using residuals to produce bioethanol. And the latest example now is also coming from sugarcane from my last trip when I was down visiting Kukal and also visiting Saint-Martin. We are seeing then in Saint-Martin that we are starting to use residuals from the sugarcane production and to produce methane gas. And methane gas that can be used then to run in Scania trucks or Scania buses, but also in our competitors' vehicles. And the good thing about this that the biofuels, regardless if it's biodiesel or bioethanol or biogas in this case, all available in Brazil as the role model here, you can use it also in older vehicles. So we're not only sort of making an incremental sort of improvement. We can go back to 5, 10 years old vehicles and we can change the energy that are used in those vehicles. And for me, that is the way that we create like a real transformation. And that is the way we can then fulfill our commitment when it comes to our science-based targets then to reduce the CO2 emissions, not only from our own operation, but from our customers' fleet. And if I take the example from Brazil, we cannot do this alone. We need to do it together with science, with academia. We need to do it together with local, national politicians. We need to do it together with the legislator, with our customers that are buying the vehicles, but also our customer's customer who's buying transport, that they start to request that we want to have a transport that is done with a CO2 emission that is zero. Because these biofuels, when they are produced in the right way, like we do in Brazil from residuals, they reduce CO2 with 95% compared to fossil fuels. So I think this is a very low-hanging fruit that we can use to transform our transport system. But we need to do it together. Also together with the public so that we create the demand and a push as consumers also for these kinds of transport. So the industry that I belong to then, transport and logistics, is one of the so-called hard to abate. But I would say that whatever industry you're into, and this I think is a message mainly to you as business leaders on this webcast today. I think whatever industry you're into, sooner or later you will come to a tipping point in that industry when it no longer makes sense to run a business that is not sustainable, because you will simply not be relevant. Because when you have reached that tipping point that the basis for making business is sustainability, you have to transform. And if you do not transform, no one will buy your products or services. No one will invest in your company, and no one would like to work for you. And for me, that is the driving force. And that's why I say, and we believe at Scania, that the strong link between profitability and sustainability is there. We can prove it. And that's why I believe, and what we have done in our company, is not to put sustainability in a corporation as a strategy on top of everything we do. No, you need to integrate it into the core of the company, the purpose of the company, the values, into the business model. That's when it sits. And if you do that, you will be rewarded. You will be rewarded with a better business and with a better planet. Thank you very much for listening. And I also appreciate all the good input that has been coming up from previous speakers. And together, as I was said in the beginning, we can do it. Let's reach out across the aisle between different stakeholders and join arms, and we will prevail. Thank you.
Muitíssimo obrigada, senhora.
Thank you very much, Mr. Henriksson, for your talk. It was very inspiring with several good projects that Scania is carrying out throughout the world. I would like to thank once again the presence of Mr. Fabriansi, Dr. Sukhdev, Dr. Rockström, and Mr. Henriksson for this first part of our event. To the specialists and CEO that are with us on Zoom, please stay online for the second part of our event. For those who are watching us on YouTube, I would like to stay with us to watch a wonderful institutional video from Scania that we will show in a minute. And thank you all for being with us. On behalf of Brazil Global Pact, I would like to wish you all a great day. Thank you.
The most vital partnership we have as humans is with our planet, and we have to make this relationship more sustainable. And with the conditions for change varying across the planet, we cannot wait for a one-size-fits-all solution. We must act now. Which is why we partner with the transport companies who share our commitment to a fossil-free future. The companies who continually strive to reduce emissions now, not tomorrow, making alternative fuels everyday fuels, who make pioneering solutions make business sense. Our partners are the enablers all around the world who share our beliefs, our vision. The architects, the planners and mayors, reimagining our cities, who we work with to clean up the air, moving people freely through the streets. The academics, the visionaries, researching and developing intelligent transportation systems. The connectivity experts, orchestrating the flow of people and goods. The innovators, taking the steps towards electrification, meeting the challenges, making the breakthroughs with battery technology and infrastructure, lightening the load and extending the range, allowing us to keep the cities flowing, making silent deliveries while others sleep. Our partners are the people all around the world who share our goals, our determination, who challenge us, as we challenge them, to create the sustainable solutions we need now.